Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session from the Maternal Health Learning and Innovation Center. We very much appreciate you joining us today. My name is Alice Pollard, and I'm the training coordinator with the Maternal Health Learning and Innovation Center. MHLIC is a new national resource center developed to accelerate innovative and evidence-informed interventions that improve maternal health and eliminate maternal health inequities. We've got a really exciting webinar today, Advancing Equity in Our Work, which is the fourth and final webinar in the Maternal Health Learning and Innovation Center Equity and Engagement series. As I said, this is the fourth webinar that our wonderful engagement core has put together, and we'll be talking about some of the other presentations in the series and providing a link in the chat. So if you missed those, you'll be able to catch up after today's webinar. And we have a very phenomenal speaker that we're so excited to have join us today. So I'm going to very quickly go through some housekeeping items, and then we'll get straight to the presentation. So just a few housekeeping items for you today. We are recording today's presentation, and it will be available on our website, maternalhealthlearning.org, after the presentation. Everybody is muted. All attendees are muted today, but that does not mean that we don't want to hear from you. You'll have an opportunity to send in questions through the Q&A box that you see on your GoToWebinar panel. You should also be able to chat us, and you can send that either to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So we welcome you to get in touch with us throughout the webinar, and we will have time for questions at the end. There will also be a very short evaluation survey that we'll link to at the end of the webinar. So we would very much appreciate your feedback. So the Maternal Health Learning and Innovation Center is really thankful to have funding provided by the Health Resources and Services Administration through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We're very thankful for their support. So as I said, we've have such a great speaker today joining us today. Who is actually a wonderful partner and member of the Maternal Health Learning and Innovation Center team and of the Engagement Core, which put together this webinar series. So she's not only presenting to you today, but is helped to bring together this full series to you. So we're really grateful for that. And she has asked me not to do a long introduction of herself. She's asked us to get to know her through her presentation, but I will be putting a link to her bio in the chat so you can read about some of the great work that she's done in the past. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrea Serrano, who is a program director from Reaching Our Sisters Everywhere, and we're so happy and grateful to have her join us today. So I will kick it over to you.
Thank you. And it says the host disabled attendee screen sharing. So
Well, that is not at all what I wanted to do. So let me fix that. Okay, there you go.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and get my screen shared. And there we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, depending on where you are. Definitely appreciated the abbreviated introduction by Alice. Today, I'll be taking you through advancing equity in our work, and I'm Andrea Serrano. I am Program Director at Reaching Our Sisters Everywhere. I do not have any financial disclosures as it relates to this presentation. I do think it important to provide the lens by which I come to this work, where I look at the numbers that impact Black families in a way of a reflection. When I look at maternal mortality rates, when I look at infant mortality rates, the rates have faces in my perspective. And, last year, I had a sister who went through a very difficult pregnancy, and we had discussions on what would occur should she not make it through her pregnancy and what responsibilities I would have in looking over being guardian of my niece. So thankfully, she was able to, have baby girl. She is healthy. Everyone's healthy. But for those conversations to occur, For me, maternal mortality, and especially for Black families, Indigenous families, families of color, is an important issue that carries more than just the rate. This summer, we have seen several deaths from Black mothers that have passed during childbirth, and one has hit close to home with our Rose family. Yolanda Kadima um, passed this summer while giving birth to twins. So when we address this work and when we talk about moving forward with equity, this work is very much so carried on looking beyond the percentages, but realizing that each of these numbers have faces and families directly attached to it, and so hold very deep personal meaning. And so I would like to hold space for a moment to acknowledge families that have experienced maternal loss, families that have experienced infant loss, families that are experiencing the current realities of COVID-19 and the impact, and families that are dealing with the pandemic that is also racism. So I'll hold a minute of silence just to help center us. All right. Thank you for joining me in that moment. So, for the objectives for today, I really hope to leave with you the grounds of building a shared understanding of key concepts of racial equity to normalize conversations, including review of terminology and role of policy in advancing racial equity, along with discussing strategies for implementing racial equity analysis in our programs and initiatives. I must give you the background of Reaching Our Sisters Everywhere. Our mission was founded to address breastfeeding disparities for communities of color. Rose works to normalize breastfeeding by providing resources and networking opportunities for individuals and communities. As a national expert and in partnership with communities, we build equity in maternal and child health through culturally competent training, education, advocacy, and support. Much of what we do and how we do is very centered on community voices amongst the families we work alongside with, who direct our initiatives, who provide excellent perspectives and scopes for us to consider in our work. And so much of what I share with you today also comes from this lens. I also want to acknowledge that this series has had wonderful speakers that have led the groundwork in how we look at our biases, how we look at addressing care. And so I deeply, deeply encourage you to check out the series if you had missed any of the presentations. I know Alice will put that in the chat box, and just really wanted to acknowledge that this series is well equipped with some great information. Last but not least, it is important that I share that much of the tools and resources that I am providing comes from an experience with training from the Center of Social Inclusion, whom is now a part of Race Forward. And the cohort represented here are all ladies that participated in a training that centers first food racial equity, leading conversations about race and having productive policy changes that can be instituted at institutional levels. And so today, I share with you many of the resources and tools and skills learned from this cohort experience. Knowledge is a power that is meant to be shared, and I hope that through this conversation, presentation, that you are able to obtain some knowledge and resources in order to begin great work. And so the tools. Now, this picture is not placed here on accident. These are tools that were sitting in my garage after I had newly purchased a home that had a yard that was going to need lawn mowing, going to need plant work and all that good stuff. And so I was going to need tools in order to do this work. And a cousin of mine, her significant other said, "Hey, I have extra lawnmower and tools laying around. You can have them at no cost. I'll just come bring them to you and you'll have what you need." And so I was presented where I had a scenario. I had lawn that need cutting, and someone was able to give me the tools that I would need to address this. However, he did not take me through how to use these tools. And so for a better part of a year and a half, the lawnmower and all the accessory tools here kind of sat in the same place, um, while I sought out different ways to address my lawn care. And so what I don't want to do in this presentation is recognize the need and provide tools without instruction. And to that point, because we have an hour or so, much of what I'm going to share here is an appetizer. I'm going to go over some great tools and techniques and understand that this information and training is a much more in-depth training that usually takes more time. But I'm presenting to you some key things that you can start to take away with and um, give you a lens that you can start to look at your work with, but know that this training is much deeper and you may have questions at the end of this, and that is a beautiful thing to have. So, in getting started, what do we see in our communities? And because Rose is really centered around maternal infant health and addressing inequities, especially through breastfeeding, I am going to share just some of those pieces that are connected to breastfeeding to help build context, but know that this can be transcended beyond breastfeeding. And so in our communities, we see that breastfeeding is represented in many different ways and how breastfeeding occurs. In different ways, families are meeting their needs to breastfeed, the different supports that are involved in providing human milk to babies. And it's important that we acknowledge that Black women do breastfeed. The latest breastfeeding rates, which I do have in these slides, acknowledge that about 73 plus or minus, and we'll take that plus, push it up a little higher, of non-Hispanic African Americans do breastfeed. And so that means the overwhelming majority of Black families in this country do breastfeed. And so some of the conversations that take place around this oftentimes approach breastfeeding, especially amongst Black families, at a deficit. And I think it is important to acknowledge and change that narrative. When we look at the Healthy People 2020 objectives, many of the target points that had been set out around maternal infant health, especially as it relates to breastfeeding, are rates that we are currently on target with for the most part. And I believe the latest breastfeeding report card does show that we met our MICH 21.5 goal of exclusive breastfeeding through 6 months for, I think it's 25%. And that is noted here. And so we see that the overwhelming majority of families have at least initiated breastfeeding. We know that duration wise, there are things that impact the ability to sustain those high rates. And I think it's important to remember just that lens, that the majority of families do start off breastfeeding. And when we talk about other health initiatives and work that we do with families, um, a good baseline is to recognize, like, where is everyone starting off, especially when it comes to certain behaviors that we are trying to maybe increase that have positive health outcomes, and identifying if folks are starting off high in doing the healthy behaviors and throughout time there's a decrease in those rates, really taking the time to analyze what is contributing to the decreasing in rates. And to also note, the CDC in a report presentation that they had given had acknowledged that they had noticing that although breastfeeding rates continue to climb, that we see a, a widening in the gap between ever breastfed and between white and black. And so this is a trend that they have been noticing kind of increasing since 2009 through to 2014. And it's something to keep in mind that as we address policies and impact, do work around programs that are impacting some of these outcomes, noticing if there is a different trend taking place, that perhaps if an initiative is causing overall rates to go up and we start to disaggregate by race and notice that a certain gap is widening, it allows for some deeper thought in what are some targeted approaches or initiatives that need to take place in order to continue to narrow the gap. So as we strive to increase rates overall, we should not also see an expanding in inequity gaps as we do those efforts. And when we do, to call attention to that and spend time around addressing narrowing that gap. So that trend can also be seen at 6 months and also 12 months. So I just wanted to highlight those pieces for that perspective as we look at data and information. Overall, the gap that has occurred between Black breastfeeding rates and breastfeeding rates for all other racial ethnic groups has been sustained for quite a bit of time. And for that reason, you have initiatives that spend time on really making targeted efforts towards increasing that. And that's one of the reasons why Rose is an organization that we are, is to narrow that gap as we continue to support families through this process. And so one way that we wanted to analyze data a bit further in looking at what's going on in our communities is through funding from W.K. Kellogg Foundation and a collaborative with Health Connect One, we worked on the Saving Tomorrow Today and African American Breastfeeding Blueprint. This is available for free download on the Rose website. And what it does is take in a lens, a national look at breastfeeding rates and trends for Black families and in comparison to families of different racial ethnic backgrounds. And when we take into that, in creating this work, we not only utilize listening sessions, but also PRAMS data. And as we analyze this work, there are a couple of trends that we had noticed. When we looked at breastfeeding initiation across groups in comparison, where the dotted line represents all women and the blue line represents Black African American, and we look at by region, we note the difference in the breastfeeding rates between these different regions. And not to say that in the Western region, where the gap is narrowed, where it's there, not to say that no inequities exist, but taking into context that geography matters in initiations. And when we're working out how to impact health outcomes, that we take into consideration what's going on in our local communities or where we're locally set. And if you do national work, take into account that different regions are going to have different needs or priorities that's going to need to be put in place in order to address those families in that area. When we looked at breastfeeding duration during the neonatal period, and this is the PRAMS data from 2019 through 2015, we noted that in the first 4 weeks, we've seen dips in breastfeeding rates. And for non-Hispanic, African American, Black families, that decrease is 21% per week. So in the first 4 weeks, breastfeeding rates go down for Black families at a rate of 21% each week. And when we look at data like this, it is important to start to center when we're going to address programming and going to address how we are going to make some differences, that the way we interpret this information is important. And for us, in looking at this information, it told us that there's definitely needed to be some more added support around these first 4 weeks postpartum to help make a difference in breastfeeding duration. And we know this is a crisis period time just because folks are returning home and having to navigate breastfeeding journey. And this is, of course, prior to COVID-19. So I can't imagine what this data would kind of look like now during this time. But noting that during these first 4 weeks, it's a normal period of time for families to be getting their dance together with having a new baby home. And regardless of whether they have older children or not, it is still a time where they are kind of getting in sync as each baby is their own baby, right? And so for us, when we look at this information, it gave us the message that we need to do some work that targets support in supporting families during this time frame. When we looked at the data information from the PRANS data for the top 4 reasons why U.S. women gave for why they stopped breastfeeding, uh, this included, I thought I was not producing enough milk or my milk dried up, breast milk alone did not satisfy my baby had difficulty latching or nursing, it was too hard, painful, or too time consuming. And so for all racial ethnic groups, these were those top 4 reasons. And for some, one placing more significant than the other, but I thought I was not producing enough milk or my milk dried up being the leading factor for all groups. All of these issues are issues that adequate breastfeeding support could truly impact, right? And so when we're talking about what is needed to address, inequity gaps when it comes to breastfeeding or supporting families, we can center to know that there's some initiatives that can take place where we address these key reasons, right, on meeting families' needs in order to help them achieve the goal that they have set. Um, CDC released the new breastfeeding report card, like I had mentioned. So they also provided some really great data, and I just wanted to share it regarding breastfeeding rates as it relates to 2017 births. And they did a wonderful job at offering the information from the different months period and key milestone times. But this is for all groups. It's not broken down necessarily by race. So just the context that there is a large majority of families that are breastfeeding, are um, making this attempt. And so how we choose this language and how we start to approach initiatives, that lens that we take in addressing the needs, we can know that clearly families know that breastfeeding is important. Is how is it working in their lifestyle, and what are we doing in our work um, to make this dance easier for families, or in helping them meet their needs. And so, as I go from breastfeeding data, I want to take a moment to when we start analyzing our more local level information related to birth outcomes. So, take for example Georgia, which is home for me, and we look at preterm births, and we look at where the concentration of preterm births occur. And if we delve a little deeper, we look at from March to Dimes Perry stats on preterm birth rates and those changes from last year, and you start to, just be able to understand where rates are going. Are they worsening? Are they improving? This is how we start to see what's going on in our community. When we break it down by DeKalb County, which is what's home for me, and in comparison to Georgia, you start to see that preterm birth rates increase, and we know that preterm births are a major factor in infant mortality, right? So we know if those rates are extremely high, we know when we look at infant mortality, usually that what holds a high percentage of causes for infant mortality is around preterm births. As these numbers continue to go up, it has a major impact on what our mortality rates look like. And so in looking at preterm births broken down by race, we see that for Black families, that rate is highest among all groups when it comes to DeKalb County. And so I did this kind of transition on purpose of going from what we look at when we're looking at national data and information, when we start looking at our state, and then when we start coming down specifically to our counties and how we analyze what the data is showing us. When we look at infant mortality rate, once again, for Black families, this rate is the highest at 9.1. And so we can look at this information here at a bar graph, but I think it's important to start putting additional visual layer on top of this. So in the blue, we have infant mortality rates by geographic region, and the darker note representing where the infant mortality rate is the highest. On the screen where you have the white with the red and orange kind of colors, this represents percent of population. So this is specific to DeKalb County, and I'm just taking you through the process of how we analyze data and information as we start navigating how we start implementing change. And so here, the highest percentage of white families are depicted by the darker red. And if we look over at this map, we can see that those are also the spaces where it has the lowest percentage of infant mortality. When we start to take a look at where Hispanic families are concentrated along this area and how it overlays here, we see that those darker regions of infant mortality rate, in essence, higher rates of infant mortality rates, kind of align with these same spaces. And then when we look at percentage of Black families, where higher population exists of Black families, you can also find that infant mortality rates that are most highest also overlap in those areas. And the unfortunate thing is that you can put multiple different outcome factors, whether it is economics around income, where you can, different health measures. You will find that many of these maps kind of have this same trend. So with COVID-19 being present, I thought it was important to also look at the population density map around that in cases. And so this is through July 2019. And once again, where areas of, Hispanic families and non-Hispanic Black families live, we find that the concentration of cases are higher in those areas. And when we look at the data, when it comes to deaths related to COVID-19, along with proportions of cases by race, large proportions are still amongst Black families. And so I lay this out for the reason of when we start to analyze or start to come about what are things that need to be addressed, it starts to help to layer the factor of why we center our work around addressing racism. So, why do these disparities exist? Now, what I laid out here is not the exact answers to those previous slides, but they reflect on the importance of what policies and institutions matter, and whether this is policies at a larger federal level or within an organization. All of those are policies, and at each of those levels, they make a significant impact. So within institutions and how we prioritize work on what we do, how we do it, how we frame the conversation, um, and then put out policies in relations to that makes a significant difference. So for example, when we talk about the concentration of poverty, we acknowledge the history that the Federal Housing Administration had around redlining and that concentration of poverty. I wish I could go deeper into that, but in recognizing the essence of time, I'm just providing us a high level overview of that. With that concentration of poverty and where we see a lot of the maps when we start looking at population densities and where health outcomes kind of overlap, you can see that those trends continue to exist. And a lot of those had been centered from the impacts of, redlining, that concentrated poverty that reduce the resources and opportunities for communities to generate generational wealth in order for zip codes and schools to get the adequate funding, in order for the hospitals in those areas to get the necessary funds that they need to thrive, and so forth. When we look at things like where trash facilities are set, for example, this is a map of the DC trash transfer station, and the yellow dots are reflective of where the trash stations are, where the dumps are held, and the concentration of green represents the Black Census Tract for 2010. And so the darker green, higher population of Black families, and that also seems to also be where a higher concentration of the trash stations also sit. And when we talk about health outcomes and things that are impacting families in that area. We talk about asthma, so on and so forth. We have to also remember the different uh, policies and authorizations to have trash, large trash landfills areas in those communities, and what that impact is on their health outcomes. So it's not just a matter of, oh, does this family go for a walk, but what is the environmental context in which you're living in, and what things have been passed and allowed. When we look at the interstate system and where interstate freeways have been placed, oftentimes they run through communities, right? And we know the environmental context to that. So this is what I mean when we talk about policies and institutions matter, because where things are authorized or how things are implemented plays a significant role in how it starts to impact the families in our communities. And so when we are looking at ways of addressing that impact, we have to move beyond just all the onus purely going on family behavior, but what are the other structures that are contributing to the health outcomes we're seeing? And the California Endowment ad resource where they looked at zip codes. And in one particular zip code, you had a life expectancy of 73 versus another where it's 88. And similarly, if you were to look at population density maps, families of color more predominantly lived in the Stockton area, and so forth. And their campaign, is that your zip code shouldn't predict how long you'll live. And these are the reasons why we center race, because racial inequality in the US, from infant mortality to life expectancy, race can predict how well you will do in many of these factors. And so it is a difficult conversation to broach, sometimes we have a conversation of, well, what about economics? That should play a role, income and so on and so forth, our education level. Like, don't these things play a role in health outcomes and so forth? And they do. I do not want to negate that. But understanding that even when we correct for income or education level and so forth, there's still inequities that lie when you look at the breakdown when it's disaggregated by race. And so there are three key factors that we also need to keep in mind about race. Race is a construct and it is not biologically determined. Policy drives the social construction of race and has contributed to the changing ideas and definition of race over time. And we did not choose the system. None of us was here when, policy was being written about who was going to be legally defined as Black, who was going to be defined as white. None of us was here. But understanding that we have a responsibility to address the systems that are built under those policies or underneath that scope is an important key factor. And like I said, I would love to go deeper into these particular pieces, but this is the appetizer. So how do we start to move forward in this work? And the first piece is understanding that we have to set a shared context. The National Effective Practice has a cycle that we run through. The first is normalizing. So we have to have a shared analysis of definitions, and meaning that folks should be on board with understanding what the terms mean, what the priorities are, and having that conversation. Because if I talk about equity here, like I've been doing, and we have a certain context in which we're running on it. But of course, if I go to a home loan officer and I mention equity, their definition of that term is completely different. Along with also having a shared discussion around urgency and priorities, right? What needs to be addressed first? Because addressing all things at one time isn't going to be the most effective approach. But when we have a shared conversation and mapping out what are the different areas that we need to start impacting and which one are we going to go at first, we can put that energy and time and be very intentional in that work when we start to prioritize and work through it. We had to organize both internal in- infrastructure and partnerships. And so that internal piece is really acknowledging the accountability, who's responsible for what, having that clear communication set up, and how we start to move through these efforts, along with understanding the importance of partnership. Especially with communities and non-traditional stakeholders, right? Whether this is in the case if we're doing breastfeeding work, business chambers of commerce, because of course our families are either going back to work for these businesses, right? And so working with the chambers of commerce to ensure that they're going to have policies are put into practice, things that are supportive of families returning to work after having a newborn. After we map out and organize what our different structures look like, our network of partners and a relationship base with those partners where there's reciprocity in that relationship, we then operationalize utilizing racial equity tools and the data, using data to develop strategies and drive results. And that's why I walked us through all those different data points and how we look at them, because we cannot completely make meaningful change if we're not disaggregating information. It's wonderful to see the overall, but we have to look a little deeper at each of these pieces to see what group, what community is not rising with the tide, in essence. And this is a circle because this is a process that must be repeated throughout your initiatives and programming and policies assessments. Then from there, we look at and understand the different levels, I don't want to say levels, but different structures of racism. So individual racism, the prejudgment bias or discrimination by individual based on race. institutionalized racism, policies and practices, procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, often unintentional and inadvertently, and structural racism, a history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions combining to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. So essentially, structural racism is made up of the many institutions. And for this work that I'm going to dive deeper into, I'm really centering around institutional and structural racism and impacting that work there. It is not to say that addressing individual racism is not important. That is very important. The piece of when we address institutional and structural racism, it does not allow for that individual racism to perpetuate. We don't keep policies in place that allow for individual acts of racism within our institutions, within our policies to continue to go forward and continue to do harm. Instead, we work through and make these policy changes that start to move those pieces out where there are consequences or so forth that's enforceable, to start to eliminate that. When we talk about equity and equality, so equity involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives versus equality, which in contrast gives everybody the same. So an escalator made up of the same parts goes at the same speed. If everyone stepped on this escalator at the same time, they will all rise to the top at the same time. However, as I showed in many of the data points, no one is starting at the same place on this escalator. And so if we implement programs and work that's just going to equally disseminate the resources across the board, equally move this escalator on up, then there is always going to continue to be inequity that exists. Instead, we must restructure and see, does this escalator, can this stay the same speed? And because this person's further up along, and this one we just slightly increase in speed for them to go up a little faster to help them catch up. And, you know, this third person, they so far back, they're coming out the elevator trying to catch the escalator. What are ways that we can address this in order for them all to reach the top at the same point? And isn't that the work that we are trying to do, is to close those inequity gaps? And so when we're looking at how we start to do our work and evolve our initiatives and programming, that's the lens that is important to take into place. And so examples of what we see with this is the dips that we have in the sidewalks. The ADA, realized and noted that for our brothers and sisters that are differently able, their ability to navigate within their own communities was impacted by not having easy access to go from one sidewalk to the next, or to enter into buildings and so forth. And so in noting the specific need of a specific population, the instituted, putting dips in the sidewalk in order to meet those needs, or we see ramps that go into buildings and so on and so forth, specifically for our differently abled brothers and sisters that have to navigate within their communities. And although this work was tailored for a specific community, the broader community still benefited, right? So for us that do programs all over the place and we have to, get everything from the vehicle into the building we're going to go put up a table at or a booth at, isn't it so much better to go just through a ramp rather than having to balance everything on stairs going up and trying to figure out how to get into the building? I know I'm a one trip wonder type of person. I will pile my cart, dolly, whatever it might be, as high as I possibly can to do just one trip to get everything in. When you're traveling, families with strollers, right? Instead of having to kind of kick the stroller up onto the curb, just maneuvering. And even those, on skateboards that probably shouldn't be skateboarding across the sidewalk can still benefit from having these accommodations. And that's how we look at how doing equitable work looks like, right? When you're doing work that centers the needs of a specific population most impacted, that by addressing those needs, we create broader solutions that support the greater population. And that in itself is um, what we look at when we're doing racial equity. And so for us, racial equity is when one, race no longer is a determinant of social economic life outcomes. And in addressing racial equity, we improve outcomes for everyone. And doing racial equity work is both a process and outcome we have to seek to achieve. So the overall definition is when racial equity is when our institutions and systems work individually and together to work well for the benefit of all people, regardless of racial ethnic background. And in our examples with breastfeeding rates, for us, that would look like this gap no longer existing, that we are all on the same breastfeeding line, rising up in breastfeeding initiation rates, in duration, and so forth. And so how all this starts to play a role when we look at how we're instituting policy changes or how we're instituting programming, we have to understand as humans, we take in a lot of information at one time and we quickly start to put things in individual and collective meaning. And so for us, making those collective meanings, we generate these schemas. So if I say millennials, all of us to a degree can picture someone in our head. And if in your mind, when I say millennial, you thought of somebody with a cell phone, like immediately the cell phone was a part of the depiction you made in your head. A part of that is set by environmental context, right? I remember giving this same presentation to a group where two of the students were exchange students from a different country, and I said millennials, and it wasn't necessarily, a schema set for them. They were kind of confused, like, what? So the social constructs or the environment definitely shapes how we build out our schemas. And granted, we do this, of course, because we have to delve through information quite quickly. But it's important to realize that in sometimes setting schemas are how we kind of set narrations for terms or categorize people. Bias can play a role. And it's to understand that we all carry the bias. We all carry bias, but it's how we act on them is when they can become discriminatory. And the thing is that suppressing bias is shown to induce more um, prejudice acts as opposed to acknowledging when that bias occurs and just having their own internal conversation about, okay, we need a break. Why am I having this feeling? Why is this thought coming up for me? And making a conscious effort to maneuver around it. And so explicit bias is when it's expressed directly. In this case, we don't rent specifically to this specific group, versus implicit bias, which tends to operate at a subconscious. So, for example, a property manager doing more criminal background checks on African Americans than whites. But if you were to ask them, do you do this? They'll say, no, I definitely don't. I randomly check everybody. But if you look at the data then demonstration shows that one group is often more targeted than the other. And so when we're looking at how we maneuver in our projects and so forth, the biggest impact and work is going to be around addressing pieces that carry a note of the implicit bias. And so, like I said, suppressing or denying bias thoughts um, increases prejudice rather than eradicate it. And so, acknowledging that piece is going to be the first piece in being able to redirect and find strategies of developing interventions for it. So we know that implicit bias impacts health. I won't, in the essence of time, I won't delve too deep into these slides of examples of biases within the health system, but I will spend some time on this effort around diversity. Diversity is an element towards addressing equity. It is not the sole factor. And so we say that because in having diversity present, that is very important. The also important piece is that there is shared power in that decision making table when we diversify our work groups and diversify um, folks that are able to contribute to the planning and so on and so forth, that in increasing the different people part of the process, that power is also shared there as well. So diversity is a piece of addressing equity. It is not the sole answer. There's other elements that must be implemented. And so, what can we do to disrupt the patterns and trends? We have to acknowledge that disconnect does exist, and it's where we find this truth on that there's a disconnect between the resources we having to offer and how families are receiving them, and whether this is making improvement in the health outcomes within our communities. And so, through a process of really gauging institutional explicit, institutional implicit, individual explicit, individual implicit, is how we kind of start to work through those pieces. So police department in Seattle worked through this example, where they created this example through their collaborative with the Center of Social Inclusion. So institutional explicit, policies that explicitly discriminate against one group. And so in this case, this department gave an example of a police department refusing to hire people of color. Institutional implicit, policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally. And this is an example that the department provided, which was focusing on street level drug arrest. So we know the data shows that drug use there isn't a large differentiation between drug use amongst different racial ethnic groups. However, environment plays a role. So if you're doing more street level drug arrests, you're going to end up capturing more folks of color in those arrests, and therefore this is how they utilize an example of how implicit policies can impact one group over the other. The individual pieces I won't go over, but it's this institutional implicit is where most of our work has to get done when we're talking about advancing equity. And so when we go through this process and developing whatever the product is, we have to actively insert racial equity into the decision-making process. And so what is a tool to this? So we look at what are the desired results, and all those listed at number one. When we're talking about the desired results, it can't just be centered just within our own institution, our own programming. We also have to seek community input on what are the community desired results as well to help shape this. And then it gives us an excellent piece on the analysis of data, because it lets us know if we're missing components of data, is there things we're not looking at? Are there questions we should be asking? Are there elements of the outcomes of our communities that we're, might be overlooking? Do we need to disaggregate this data? Yes, we need to. But that analysis of data can then start to break out some additional pieces. Like, these are our desired results. This is where we're currently at. This is our baseline after we analyze the data. And then we go for a broader community engagement where we check in with the community and say, are we aligned with this? This is what we desired, the outcomes we would like to see. Our baseline is telling us this. What are we all collectively experiencing? What are things that are possibly impacting why where we are isn't matching where we want to be, right? And having those true conversations where the is listening is a big tool being utilized, actually listening to what the community is providing and feedback. And then from there, shaping strategies that center that racial equity component before we go into implementing the plan, right? There's a lot of intentional work done before we start implementing a plan. Then we set up the communications and accountability as we start implementing and checking in with folks and everything, and revisit this process as we check in. So this is just a high level overview of this racial equity tool process. And I'm noting I have 4 minutes left, so I'm gonna keep it moving. With institutional racism, ways that we work through that is examine policies and practices within our own institutions for bias and discriminatory practice, especially around amongst implicit work. And you might be thinking, well, how do we navigate the implicit pieces when we're looking at our data and we're disaggregating by groups most impacted? And if we're seeing that for one group, they are thriving just well while other groups aren't, it starts to help us shape, okay, there might be other things at play here that are impacting this. If we're having a breastfeeding group at the hospital at 10 o'clock a.m. and we're noticing that, only a certain population is attending, they're able to make it, and you start to ask additional questions and you map out, okay, the folks that are most impacted are those that are working during this time, i.e. lack the paid leave to take long time after work. Hospital parking is $6, so they may not have the additional funds to be able to pay for parking. The bus stop is 2 miles away, so if they don't have a car, now they're having to walk an additional 2 miles to come to a 10 o'clock breastfeeding. Those are the ways we start to analyze how our programs, our initiatives might carry some implicit bias by really looking at that data and asking questions, getting feedback as to, how come, what are ways that we can better support you in receiving our support services, right? And listening. Of course, advocating for large institutional change, so that way policies and can be put in place and enforceable when individual, racism takes part in place, that there are things that can help to eradicate individual racism that impact families within the institution. And of course, through making and navigating institutional changes, that's how we start to reshape some structural racism. And so my biggest target and ask to you in this piece is really take a time to look at the institutional implicit policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally, and recognizing the different structures that might be at play that is creating some of the inequities, or um, maybe not allowing your program support resources to actually connect and meet with the community needs. There's no magic wand answer to this, but these are the steps that I'd like to share with you on how we start making the first move towards advancing equity in our work. And with that, because I know I have 1 minute left, I'm going to end my slides here. The other ones were just examples of what Rose has kind of done, but I'll end here and take it over to my email address. There we go. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. I think that was really important, and we're so grateful that you could be on today to share with us. I do want to just touch base. I know some people might need to get off the webinar now, but we'll be sure to send out the recording. I wanted to check in with Kimmery and Sarah to see if you all had any thoughts that you wanted to share in closing. And while I look for you all there so I can unmute you, I just wanted to, I will put everything in the chat as well. Dr. Sarah Verbeest and Dr. Kimmery Bug are the chairs of our engagement core work group. So we really are appreciative of them too, of leading all of this webinar series as well.
Well, thank you. This is Sarah Verbeest. I want to thank Andrea for that presentation. This is really essential to the work of the MHLIC. It's nice to have it recorded so that we can continue to go back and listen to that. We also would like to invite everyone to join us for follow-up conversation, because there's a lot to unpack. And we'll have a chance to have some smaller discussion on this topic upcoming. Alice, you can put those dates in the chat. I'm just grateful that I get to work with and learn from Andrea all the time on this project.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, this is Kimmery Bug, and I would like to echo what Sarah said, and also ask for you to please join us in our collaborative conversations that we will be doing during office hours. So again, we can have that safe space, that brave space to really break it down for us personally and share. So thank you all so much for being here. Your time is greatly appreciated.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much, Sarah and Kimmery, for letting me put you on the spot there. And we really do appreciate the presentation today and everyone's time. We will send out that follow-up information. I did put the date in the chat of August 21st. There'll be a couple of opportunities to participate. So we'll make sure to send all of that. And if you have any questions, please get in touch and we'll make sure to provide space for those Q&A as well. So thank you again. Any last thoughts anybody wants to share before we end? All right.
Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone. And hope everyone has a great afternoon. Take care.